Hi, I'm Liz Bates, and on today's Sky News Daily, we'll explain why Turkey's strongman leader is facing the biggest challenge to his authority in a decade.
Donald Trump is heading back to the White House.
Together we can truly make America great again.
We are in for an unpredictable but fascinating 4 years.
And we're going to be following every twist and turn for the first 100 days. We'll be bringing you the latest updates and analysis first thing every morning. So join me, James Matthews.
Me, Martha Kelnick.
And me, Mark Stone.
For Trump 100, every weekday at 6 a.m, wherever you get your podcasts.
It all started last week when Istanbul Mayor Ekrem Imamoglu was chosen by his party to be the presidential candidate for Turkey's next election in 2028. 2 days later, Imamoglu was arrested and accused of corruption. He said it was politically motivated. President Erdogan said it wasn't. But look, let's be honest. In this new era of global politics, strong men seem to do what they want. But it's also the era of social media, and Imamoglu is pretty good at it. He used it to tell his supporters to come out in protest, and they did in their thousands. Since then, huge crowds have gathered. There have been violent clashes with the police and over 1,000 arrests.
Very difficult to breathe in this atmosphere, but even so, these are the biggest protests that Turkey has seen in more than a decade.
Alex Crawford is Sky's special correspondent. She's based in Istanbul, where there's been unrest on the streets every night for almost a week.
I mean, I was really quite surprised at how big the protests have been. I mean, tens of thousands of people across the country, a huge number in Istanbul, the country's largest city. We took about 40 minutes from where the road was blocked leading up to the demonstration to actually walk to the centre. So that gives you an idea of just how deep the protest was. And remember, all these demonstrations at the moment have been banned. So they're not meant to be taking place at all. All these people are defying the governor's order not to hold these public demonstrations. There's a huge number of police there, all in riot gear. And for many hours, there was kind of a standoff of the protesters throwing various things at them, firing off fireworks, throwing flares. This is what I observed. And the police firing back rubber bullets, plastic pellets, and a lot of pepper spray. A lot of the demonstrators were wearing masks or covering their faces, sometimes wearing sunglasses. And I think that was not just to protect themselves from pepper spray, but also because they didn't want to be face recognized or to be picked up, and have been quite a lot of arrests. I mean, just today we understand from the Interior Ministry and the police that 1,133 people have now been detained. And amongst them this morning were about 10 journalists, which is another worrying turn in the development of what's happening here.
So, Alex, are they contained in one particular area, or have they sprung up all across the country?
There are more than 50 provinces where protests are taking part out of a total of 81. So that's a large number of areas where these protests are taking part. The three largest cities, Ankara, Istanbul and Izmir, have all seen very, very large gatherings of people. I mean, thousands and thousands. They are the most significant protests in probably more than a decade in Turkey.
OK, Alex, just explain what started these protests.
It all kicked off on Wednesday when there was an early morning raid to detain the Istanbul mayor, as well as a number of his staff and municipal workers. He was detained and taken for questioning and presented with a 121-page document by the police and the prosecutor detailing accusations of corruption, bid rigging, consorting with armed terror groups, basically a whole load of graft and corruption, bribery charges. But Ekrem Imamoglu is not only a very popular politician, but he's also incredibly savvy as far as social media is concerned and considered a very articulate communicator. And as his detention was taking place, he filmed himself inside his walk-in closet, just getting ready, sorting his tie and talking to his supporters about this imminent detention, telling them that this was an assault on Turkish democracy and calling on them too to defend democracy. And he's gone on to carry on tweeting, presumably through his lawyers, calling all 84 million people in Turkey to take to the streets and to defend democracy. And of course, this has very much alarmed the Turkish authorities and President Erdogan. Most recently, the Interior Minister went on to warn that unrest on the streets would not be tolerated. Liz, it's just living in Istanbul. It's a very connected city. It's got, first-class internet usually. It's got great roads. It appears to be on the surface a very functioning city. But since the arrest of the Istanbul mayor, there's been a real slowdown of the internet. We understand that certain accounts for opposition politicians have been restricted. Everyone's noticed a real slowdown in the social media accounts. So all of these are being seen as a degradation of democratic rights and freedoms of speech, for instance. Of course, it's been absolutely denied by the Turkish authorities, who insist that the judicial system is separate, that it's independent, and that this has nothing to do with politics. This is all to do with a corruption investigation.
Clearly, these protests haven't come from nowhere. On the one hand, there's this festering discontent about Erdogan's rule, and that has clearly fed into the rising popularity of Imamoglu. Hannah Lucinda Smith is a journalist also based in Istanbul. She wrote a book all about Turkey's current president. It's called Erdogan Rising, the battle for the soul of Turkey. So Hannah, let's start with the two figures that are at the centre of all of this. President Recep Erdogan and Istanbul's mayor, Ekrem Imamoglu.
Yeah, I mean, in one sense, they are very different. Erdogan, of course, is the leader who's defined Turkey in the 21st century. He became prime minister in 2003. In 2014, he became president. He's not been out of power in all of that time. But he also started as the mayor of Istanbul back in the 1990s. And at that time, he was the rebel voice. The government in Turkey at that time was staunchly secular. It repressed conservative Muslims in much the same way that Erdogan now is repressing secular Turks and Kurds. And he was also sent to prison while he was mayor of Istanbul. And when he came out, his popularity had soared, and that's what brought him into national office. Now, Ekrem Imamoglu is, of course, ideologically very, very different. He's part of the CHP, the Republican People's Party, which is the main opposition party here in Turkey. It's a secular party. But Imamoglu has also, used the mayorship of Istanbul to really launch himself as the biggest challenge to Erdogan in these past 2.5 decades. He took the mayorship first in 2019. Imamoglu was the first person to really beat Erdogan at the ballot box. And since then, his popularity has grown. And, the timing of Imamoglu's arrest, it came just before he was about to be announced as the CHP's candidate for the upcoming presidential elections. And the fact that he has been arrested now, that's absolutely to do with the threat that he poses to Erdogan.
Do you think that this kind of emerging political figure in Imamoglu, is he the biggest threat that we have seen so far to President Erdogan?
Absolutely. And, that's partly down to, the fact that Imamoglu, again, is so similar in many ways. He's also from the Black Sea region of Turkey, as Erdogan is. The Black Sea is known for being very religious, very nationalist, kind of very, macho, tough guy image in those towns and cities along the Black Sea. He also has this very bombastic speaking style. Imamoglu really kind of commands a crowd in the way that Erdogan does as well, which is something that's very popular in Turkish politics. All the Turkish leaders, they all sort of come from this very macho, nationalist perspective. It's something that plays really well here. He's managed to extend his profile and reach, not just in Istanbul, but in Turkey and even outside Turkey as well. I mean, it's incredibly, there's also been protests in London, in Germany, you know, Turks who live there also protesting. So that's just a sign of the extent of Imamoglu's appeal and just why Erdogan is so scared of him.
So clearly he is quite a competent political figure, as you've just described. Is there also something about the timing? We know Erdogan is now in his third term, even though according to Turkey's political rules, its constitution, he shouldn't really be in a third term. Do you think the context of all of this is that Turkey's population is ready for a change?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's really interesting to draw parallels between the protests that are happening now and the protests that were happening 12 years ago, the Gezi Park protests, which is the last time that there was really this kind of, you know, mass street movements against Erdogan. Back in 2013, there was a lot of kind of, you know, pent up political dissatisfaction amongst the youth, particularly amongst sort of leftist youth, secular youth. They didn't like the direction that Erdogan was going in, a kind of more Islamist direction. But, you know, economically, the country was doing quite well. Now the context is completely different. Turkey's been in this grinding economic crisis for the past 5 years. People's purchasing power has absolutely crumbled. Inflation at some point was hitting kind of 80%. So people are really suffering on that scale now. But also Erdogan has grasped a lot more power as well since 2013. He's, you know, in 2013 basically kicks out any dissenters within his party. Then after the coup attempt against him in 2016, he kicked out dissenters within the state, hundreds of thousands, civil servants, judges, police, you know, soldiers kicked out from their jobs, in many cases put in prison as well. He's got control of the media. There's very, very few opposition media channels left. And, you know, the numbers of police also have just been boosted. They about 50,000 a year for the past 5 years. So, yeah, I think people have come to a point where they're absolutely ready for some kind of change. But also people are quite worried about what direction the protests might take.
Just to go back to Imamoglu, what is he promising people in terms of substance, in terms of a change in policy direction for Turkey?
I've interviewed Imamoglu several times since he became mayor, and I think charisma is so much in Turkish politics. It is in politics everywhere, but it's really, really hard to, you know, describe how important image building is. And Imamoglu has done that alongside his press team very, very successfully. He's come up with great sort of slogans like everything is going to be beautiful. This is something that he's been repeating since 2019. But also as mayor of Istanbul, you know, technocratically, he's changed the city. He's put a lot of money into things like culture, therefore providing, you know, jobs and opportunities for young people who under Erdogan just didn't have any kind of hope at all, really. For example, if you're an actor in Turkey and you want to get a job on one of the big Ottoman drama series, you usually have to be sort of pro-Erdogan, basically. And definitely if you've been vocally anti-Erdogan, you're kind of blacklisted. So the fact that Imamoglu in Istanbul, which is a city of 16 million, it's, you know, bigger than most countries actually, put all this money into things like that and, you know, allowed people to start, you know, breathing a bit. It really felt over the past 6 years that Istanbul became a place where there was something outside of Erdogan's Turkey, and over the past week it feels like that's what's being taken away.
So what is going to happen next? It's not an easy question to answer, but no one is better placed to have a go than Sky's Alex Crawford. Alex, I'm going to ask you to try and predict the future. You're there on the ground. Where do you think this is all heading?
Yeah, you've nailed it, Liz. It is a very difficult one to call right now. I would say, looking at most recent history, President Erdogan's Turkey is not known for allowing long, widespread protests. In fact, these are slightly unusual in that they have been allowed to continue for 5 days, 5 nights. He hasn't been known to be a strong, slightly authoritarian leader for nothing. You know, when there was an attempted coup a few years ago, there was a huge crackdown and sweeping up of people, some of whom might only have had telephone numbers in their phones that were considered to be enough to implicate them to a coup attempt. And there were literally hundreds of people, civil servants, journalists, lawyers, doctors, who were perceived to be part of this attempted coup, who were rounded up and put into jail. And that's why I think there's been this explosion of discontent over the past few days. Will that continue? That is the $64 million question, or the 64 million lira question. My gut instinct says that it's unlikely that the authorities will allow this to continue for much longer. That doesn't mean that the problem is going to go away, because you can't just wipe away discontent and millions of people who are unhappy.
That's almost it for today. You can find more of Alex's coverage of the protests over on the Sky News app. Before we go, though, we just have a little favour to ask. We'd love to know a bit more about what you like and don't like about our podcasts. If you've got 5 minutes to spare, you can let us know via the survey link in the podcast description. But for now, Neil will be back tomorrow, and I'll be with you again on Wednesday as we look at the Chancellor Rachel Reeves' plans for the UK economy as she makes her spring statement. See you then.
The world is becoming increasingly complex and volatile. How can we make sense of it all?
I'm Richard Engel.
And I'm Yelda Hakim.
And we present Sky News' latest podcast, The World. Each week, we'll cut through the noise to guide you through the week's global events and explain to you why what happens out there matters to you wherever you are.
We're on the ground in some of the world's toughest places. Listen now to The World with Richard Engel and me, Yelda Hakim, wherever you get your podcasts.